And before we preview our first team today, we want to bring in college basketball analyst, staff writer for The Athletic, and this year's CAA men's basketball insider, Eamonn Brennan. Eamonn, thank you for taking time out to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Bobby.
Eamonn, when you look at the preseason team and the predicted order of finish that was just released, what immediately sticks out to you?
Yeah, well, for me, I think it was Hofstra so convincingly at the top spot. I think there are obvious reasons to get excited about Hofstra this year, right? I mean, it's a really good offensive team returning. Deshore Bowie was the defending defensive player of the year. Eli Pemberton was a real offensive weapon last season. Hofstra was just really good and barely missed out on the NCAA tournament after an incredible year. But I think there are reasons to ask questions about whether they can match what they did last season. Obviously, Justin Wright-Foreman is no longer there. He was taken in the latter half of the NBA draft, averaged 27 points per game, did so in an incredibly efficient fashion despite taking almost 35% of Hofstra's shots. He wasn't just a volume guy. You dig into his numbers and you realize that he took a lot of shots and had a lot of volume, but did so efficiently. I think he had just over 250 three-point attempts and shot like 42% from three. So he was sort of a generational player for Hofstra, and he was the fulcrum around which that offense ran. And then that offense was not only the best in the league last season and not only one of the 20 or 25 best in the country, but honestly, probably the best in the modern history of the Colonial Athletic Association. You go back all the way in Ken Palm's database, which dates back all the way to 2002, and look at the adjusted or points per game efficiencies of every team in the Colonial. That was the highest, right? Last year's Hofstra team was the most efficient offensive team the Colonial has seen in at least 17 seasons and probably longer. So whether they can recreate that without Justin Wright-Foreman is worth asking a question about. I also think because they were so good offensively last season, they didn't have to be great defensively. Hofstra was good. They were, I think, the fourth most efficient team defensively per possession in conference play, about 1.08 points per game. So really solid, but not fantastic. And I think it didn't really matter because they scored the ball so often that they could just get it out of the hoop and turn around and get another bucket. But whether that will be the case this year, I think is questionable. Whether they can guard to make up some of that margin, I think will be really interesting. So I think there were questions there maybe to ask about whether Hofstra was the overwhelming favorite and maybe the way we saw the voting pan out. But they're certainly well worth being in the mix. And like I said, there's plenty to get excited about as well.
Looking at each school's non-conference schedule, who has the potential to make the biggest splash early in the season?
Well, so I've got two, and in kind of different ways. I think the first is Charleston because of their breadth of schedule. They have a home game against Oklahoma State early on. They go to Marshall, which has been in the NCAA tournament in recent years. Interesting program under Dan D'Antoni. They have a game at UCF, which, as folks will remember, nearly knocked off Duke in the second round of the tournament last season. Really well coached, solid program in the American Athletic Conference. Will be kind of hunting a tournament bid this year and theoretically capable of getting there. They have the Wooden Legacy tournament, which starts with Wake Forest. That's, we're not sure how good Wake Forest is going to be this year. It's a really big year for Danny Manning out there. But at the very least, it's an ACC team that is going to be playing ACC competition throughout the year. So it's good for your resume if you win. Even if Wake Forest doesn't look that good, the numbers will sort of accrue over the course of the year in terms of net rating. And then if you win that game and Providence wins its first round game, you've got a game against a Friars team that is always in and around the NCAA tournament conversation, really well coached under Ed Cooley, and again plays in a high major league in the Big East. And that's just sort of all the run up to what I think is the marquee game on the schedule, and that's home against VCU in December. That VCU team is top 25. It's a team that has almost everybody returning, that was one of the best defensive teams in the country last season, that there are really, really high expectations for both inside and outside that program. Getting them on your home floor is massive, and having a chance to knock off the potential, I think, the favorite to win the Atlantic 10 this year and really make a deeper tournament run is huge. So Charleston has the games on their schedule, and I also think it's worth noting they're good enough to win those games, and that's where your chances of making noise are. It's one thing to play a tough schedule. It's another to have a real shot of building wins. And if Charleston gets those wins or gets, 4 or, 3 or 4 of them, depending on which ones, then I think you might be looking early on at a team that is at least in the conversation for an at-large sort of bubble consideration type of situation heading into conference play. And that's all you can really ask for when you're a team in the Colonial or in any real mid-major league where it's so hard to get multiple bids, is just be in the conversation, in the at-large conversation. I think Charleston has a chance to do that. My other one is James Madison, and it's sort of a one-off, but I think it's really fascinating. They play at at Virginia on November 10th. Obviously, Virginia, the defending national champions. That's a really tough game. That's the kind of game that, in theory, you sort of write off and say, well, hey, we're going to take some lumps. It's Virginia. It's John Paul Jones Arena. What are you going to do? That may be the case, but Virginia is extremely inexperienced this year. They have guys returning, but they lost 2/3 of their scoring and almost all of their leadership in the form of Ty Jerome, Kyle Guy, DeAndre Hunter, even Jack Salt, the senior center from last year's national title team. The first three of those guys are all now in the NBA. There are a lot of inexperienced guys coming into the team, a lot of new faces, freshmen, young guys, red shirts who didn't play last season. And then there is leadership in the form of Kihei Clark and Mamadi Diakite, guys who were in the rotation last year, Jay Huff, Braxton Key, kind of on the fringes of the rotation, all talented players. But talking to Virginia's coaches just this past week, in writing a piece I was writing for The Athletic about them, there is a lot of inexperience there. There's going to be a lot of figuring things out, a lot of uncertainty as to where offense is going to come from, who's going to make shots, how quickly some of the new guys can get up to speed defensively in that system that is complicated and difficult to pick up right away under Tony Bennett. And so I think it's safe to say Virginia is going to be a really good team. But on November 10th, that early in the season, it's safe, I think, also to say they're not going to be nearly as good as they're going to be December 10th or January or February 10th or March 10th. And if you can get them early and shock them early, I think it's a conceivable shock. And then you can ride that out the rest of the year as, hey, we won at John Paul Jones Arena. That's a massive chip on any team's resume.
Eamonn, as you know, the conference season has been quite entertaining the last few years. Talk to us about what you think the league race will look like this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tough to project. I think it makes sense the way the poll sort of shook out, in that the top three teams are all kind of what you'd expect, right? You've got Hofstra, Charleston, and Northeastern. Hofstra we talked about a little bit earlier. I think there is a lot of reason to be excited there again. Some questions to ask as to whether they're the overwhelming favorite, or whether they should be sort of slotted in next to Northeastern and Charleston, sort of 1A, 1B, 1C. I actually picked Northeastern in my ballot just because I think Bill Cohen's teams, the one thing this year that you'd maybe question about their team from a returning player's standpoint is point guard play. And his teams almost always have that, even if you don't necessarily know the guy who's going to be playing point guard, right? They always seem to be really well sort of handled, ball handling, mature, smart, make good plays on the offensive end. I think they'll get there. And then provided they do, Jordan Rowland is in line to have a massive season as a sophomore, as a senior, had a really, really great season as a junior, but was mostly a spot-up guy. I think he can also expand his game a little bit and put it, bring it off the dribble, get to the rim a little bit more. And he has a chance to be, a league player of the year type contender for a team that I think is going to be really, really good again. And then obviously we mentioned Charleston. There's a reason why their schedule seems favorable and seems doable. It's because they're so good. And Grant Riller is really the guy who will make them go. You sort of look at his numbers again this year. We talked about Wright Foreman. Riller wasn't far behind last year in terms of usage rate, shot percentage, up both in the 30s, had an offensive rating above 120. And normally the way it goes is you have a high volume of shots, a high volume of usage, and your efficiency goes down. Not the case for him. He did almost everything well, still had a really tidy assist-to-turnover ratio. He is the type of player that can carry a team to a league title in the conference like the CAA. You said it, it's going to be unpredictable. It almost always is. And so in a month or so or 2 months, this all might sound really silly, but I think that's how you kind of have to look at the league coming in right now from what we know. And it'll be fascinating to see what plays out.
Eamonn, thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. Enjoy the start of the season, and I'm sure we'll talk to you soon.
All right, man. Thanks for having me.